Chapter 4. The First Round. 9th hour, 19th day, 1st month, year 807. Post-Heavenfall. Classes officially began the next day and involved a morning session of defensive dueling and was followed by urban infiltration in the afternoon. The schedule would repeat every first and third day of the week, while the second and fourth days would be reserved for history of team tactics and leadership, and then marksmanship. Although fifth and sixth days were typically reserved for leisure, the Academy required every other fifth day scheduled for field exercises with her advisor. Considering the more physical nature of her first class, she chose to wear a sky-coloured tunic with black breeches and took her gen with her. Ariya wondered whether candidates needed to bring their own weapons, and logic dictated training gear would be provided. However, she couldn't help but feel eagerness from sharing its craftsmanship as a conversation starter. With the forecast favourable towards it being a dry day, the duelling course was held behind the academy on the training grounds. 16 candidates met at a courtyard with large stone tiles that were each 5-foot squares and had benches and weapon racks along the sides. Of the group, Ariya recognised Barnov, Kai, and the half-elf who was studying when she first entered the dormitories. Leading the instruction was Sentinel Maple, a bronze-skinned human who looked to be in his 50s and was dressed in a loose shirt and trousers of a martial artist. After a round of brief introductions and stretches, he asked the students, "Do any of you know what chi is?" A quarter of the students raised their hands, while the concept was foreign to Ariya. Okay. You are currently my favourites. As for the rest of you, I'll ask something similar, but slightly easier. Do you know what the Aegis is? A few more hands went up. Ariya had a vague idea, but wasn't confident enough to answer, so she kept her hand down. Slightly easier and slightly better responses, but unfortunately not as many as I was hoping. That's perfectly fine, Sentinel smirked. Rather than tell you, I'll make a quick demonstration. He pointed to one of the candidates who didn't know the answer. What's your name? Eleanor de Grey, sir. And what profession track are you following? I'm going to be a fighter. Oh, a fighter? That's too bad. You should have picked the way of the monk. He gave a look of disgust before chuckling playfully. I'm just joking, but step closer. I see you brought your spear too. Eleanor, a young human, approached, grasping his weapon. Now, I want you to try to stab me with it. Shailen slapped his chest. The candidate looked visibly confused. Really? Don't worry about it. I'm fast for my age, and I've been fighting monsters with my bare fists probably before you were born, he said, while entering into a wide fighting stance with his fist raised. His body bobbed back and forth in anticipation of the strike. Eleanor pointed his spear toward the sentinel, and the tip lunged forward with a quick thrust. To everyone's shock, Shailen did not move fast enough. The weapon pierced him in the torso, and the sentinel let out an ear-splitting scream before crumpling to the ground. "Shit!" Eleanor cried as the students quickly swarmed closer to the scene. "I'll go get the apothecary," Kai declared as he dashed off towards the academy building. By the time the Shuayan was out of sight, a laugh bellowed from the floor as Shailen rolled over and smiled. Oh, by the founders, that never gets old. The sentinel stood back up, dusted off his clothes, and nodded to Eleanor, who looked as if he was about to faint. Not bad. It looks like you even left a pretty deep scratch on me too. Shailen pointed to the puncture of his shirt and the line of inflamed skin. For most people, that thrust would have been fatal. Yet for those of us who have the training, the Aegis can protect us from many blows before it gets worn down, and the only thing between you and your organs is either your armour, shirt, or skin. He pointed to the hole. Any idea on who coined the term? Everyone remained silent or shook their heads. Over 5,000 years ago, Master Amal and Chief Librarian Daguerreo of Kogheim were the two scholars who came up with the idea. Before, it was thought only those who practice monkcraft could utilize qi to better protect themselves. However, they had a broader idea where arc is channeled and manipulated by all living creatures, and that qi is just one form. Spellcasting is as well, but arc can aid people to fight harder or be as silent as ghosts. Now, the great news is one's Aegis can be grown, and the secret ingredient is simply confidence. The more confident you are in your abilities and training, the stronger your Aegis will be. Shaylin looked around and noticed most had brought their weapons. However, I don't trust any of you to have a thick enough one, so we'll be using the blunt training weapons on the racks. If you brought your own, you can set them aside on the benches, and I wouldn't bother with it next time. Good on you for being prepared, though. Barnov let out an exaggerated sigh of disappointment as some of the students discarded their weapons. So I get the need for safety, but considering how much work I put into preparing and sharpening my axe, it's too bad I'm not going to get to use them here. Ariya nodded. I understand. On a more positive note, we can save them for when there's an actual need, so you won't have to sharpen them again. I guess, but these training weapons are going to have a completely different weight and feel to them, so it won't be the same, she said with a shrug as they approached the racks. There was a myriad of different melee war gear, from halberds and longswords to more exotic weapons like whips and nets. Aya tested a few blades, but the only one she found matching the weight and balance of her uniquely designed jian was a short sword. Everyone who needs a weapon got one? Shaylin checked. Okay, good. You all should have some experience and techniques with fighting, because otherwise you wouldn't be here at the academy. Today, I'll be having you spar with each other as a means for me to inspect how you do and offer advice on how to improve. He took count of how many candidates were attending and noticed Kai was still missing. Did the white-haired guy ever return? Hopefully he'll make it back in time, because otherwise the last person will have to practice with me. Shaylin started pairing people randomly, and Ariya saw she would be fighting against the half-elf. Rules are going to be simple. Don't kill each other, stay within the bounds of the arena, and the loser is the one who is either the first to take 2 strikes, yields, or get knocked out. Does anyone have any questions? One of the students raised their hand. Are we allowed to use spells? The Sentinel paused for a moment to deliberate the question and said, No. You'll be cleared to do so later, along with ranged weapons. But I want to keep things simple, so we'll just focus on melee for now. He called on one of the pairs to be first, but before they stepped onto the arena, the Shaylin told them to wait as he approached a nearby pedestal. He then pressed a combination of runes, and a pulse of light rippled slowly from the base to the grout between each tile before reaching the edges of the arena. As the light cascaded across, terrain features materialized from the glow to form trees, logs, streams, and ponds that completed the manifestation of a small marsh. Most of the students had their eyes and jaws wide from amazement and proceeded to shout all sorts of excited exclamations. All right, settle down. Taking advantage of your terrain is a major part of any combat encounter, so that's why I'll be randomizing it each match. Now you two can go. The Sentinel nodded to a half-orc, armed with a quarterstaff, and a lightly armoured Inferni with a greatsword. They took up positions at opposite ends of the arena. Tobias, are you ready? Shaylin checked with the half-orc, who raised his staff in confirmation. Micah, are you ready? The Inferni did the same motion with his sword. Begin! The half-orc nimbly moved on top of the logs and banks of earth, while the Inferni struggled in the muck of the marsh. As the former closed the distance, he leaped from a fallen tree and smashed into his opponent with the quarterstaff. The Inferni parried with his longsword, and the two began exchanging strikes, with the staff whirling in a blur and the sword expertly blocking each attempt. The half-orc danced and circled around his prey, as the armoured warrior firmly held his ground and waited for his opponent to wear himself out. Realising how sturdy his opponent's defensive techniques were, the staff wielder decided to switch tactics and use the end of his weapon to fling mud at the Inferni's face. Blinded by the spatter, an opening was created, and the quarterstaff whacked its target across his skull, stunning his opponent, who collapsed with a splash into a pond. Some of the students cried foul at the move, but Shaylin quieted them. Using the environment was well within the bounds of an engagement. The sparring sessions continued throughout the morning, and each one was a showcase of different styles and situations. Most of them usually resulted in 2 strikes or a yield, but on occasion, a candidate was knocked out cold. Kai returned to the teasing of the instructor, but made it in time for the 5th round, which paired Barnov against Alanor, in an arena set to the rocky environment of a cavern. When the match began, Alanor took a defensive posture and readied himself as Barnov charged in with her great axe. With a bestial roar, she swung overhead, but Alanor predicted her action and backed up to defend with a thrust. To his surprise, Barnov was quicker than she appeared and ducked out of the way before she swung from under and caught Alanor off guard. The axe slammed into his sides, and the spearman was staggered as he clumsily defended against his opponent's follow-up. Barnov continued her onslaught at Alanor, who lost ground and was being pushed back toward the edge of the arena. Yet right as his foot was about to go out of bounds, he suddenly recovered his stance and delivered a well-timed riposte into Barnov's chest to repel her and sally forward. Both would continue to trade attempts for another half-minute, growing more winded with each passing second. Eventually, it became clear that Barnov had more endurance when the wear of Alanor's exhaustion caught up to his arms and she found an opening to bash his head with the handle of her axe. The spearman fell backward, and the barbarian woman was victorious with cheers and applause. With her honed rage subsiding, Barnov clasped Alanor's arms and helped him back to his feet. "That was an incredible fight," she exclaimed. Alanor nodded breathlessly. "Definitely real close. I was hoping you would make another mistake somewhere, but it seems like I need to do more cardio to keep up." "Well, I know of ways to help with that," she snickered. "Founders, buy me lunch first." With Barnov and Alanor walking back to the benches, next up were Ariya and the half-elf. As Sentinel Shaylin prepared the arena, she noticed her opponent had selected a dagger. "That's a very confident choice," she pointed to his blade. The other candidate shrugged in response. "I'll be honest. Close-ranged fights aren't really my thing, so I usually bring this out in emergencies. You'll probably win, but I enrolled in this class to get better." "What do you prefer to wield, then?" "I can work with bows and crossbows, but dwarven rifles are my favourite. My folks were fortunate to obtain one before Nixian fell, so that's what I've mostly trained with." While the arena glowed with structures forming, the half-elf extended his hand out to Ariya. "My name's Zaran Vigilai, by the way." She returned the handshake. "Ariya Malanti." When the terrain finished materializing, what was laid before the duelists was an urban environment resembling a warehouse with crates and barrels stacked high. "I was hoping for a forest." Zaran let out a disappointed sigh. "Best of luck." The two of them took to opposing sides of the field, with some cheers from candidates who knew them. "Go Ariya!" Kai shouted in support. "Kick his ass," Barnov added. When Ariya stood in position, she quickly contemplated how she would take advantage of the environment. The crates and barrels were stacked at various heights, no taller than 15 feet, and arranged around the arena in a small, grid-like pattern. What she saw reminded her of a novel she read, where an assassin had to infiltrate past a patrol through the warehouse of a dock. The thought of the story dawned on her an idea, and she chose to gamble on the inspiration. "Zarin, are you ready?" Shaylin called, and the half-elf nodded. "Ariya, are you ready?" Ariya also nodded and raised her sword in confirmation. Satisfied with the responses, the Sentinel shouted, "Begin!" Zarin swiftly dashed between the gaps of cargo towards his opponent, with the intention of immediately confronting his opponent. Yet, as he charged forward, he was baffled by Ariya's sudden choice to sharply veer out of line of sight to the side, rather than meeting him head-on. He hypothesized she would try to flank, and turned in the direction he saw her heading to intercept. Yet where he expected to encounter the elf, she was nowhere to be seen. His eyes darted around to find any traces of her, but his investigations yielded nothing. Zarin raised his dagger defensively as he slowed his pace to perceive any signs of movement. He held his breath and remained as still as possible, relying on his sharp hearing to detect any hint of where Ariya could be positioned. Zarin immersed himself back into his days of hunting and patiently waited for his quarry. Like how his mother had taught him, to reach out with his other senses, he closed his eyes and tried to sense any indication of his opponent betraying her location. His ears suddenly picked up a single footstep. Zarin smirked as he silently crept toward where he heard the sound. As he moved closer to the source, his eyes spotted a shallow ingress between the stacked crates and the edge of a shoe jutting out from behind. He narrowed his focus, certain that Ariya was lying in wait in the same spot. Counting down and raising his dagger up to strike, Zarin quickly turned the corner and pounced on his prey. His opponent, once again, was nowhere to be seen. What was actually in the ingress on the floor was a solitary leather boot abandoned by its owner. As Zarin's brows deeply furrowed in confusion, Ariya emerged from the nearby crate and swung her training sword straight into the side of his head. Zarin's dazed body crashed down next to the shoe, along with other containers clattering as they toppled over. When Ariya realized Zarin was not rising back up, she leapt over and knelt in concern. "Are you all right?" The half-elf rolled over onto his back, clutching the side of his head. "You got me in the ear," he groaned, while noticing one of her feet was bare. Ariya breathed a sigh of relief as Shaylin declared the winner. "Definitely some lateral thinking going on there. I'm guessing you've read some Python novels," the Sentinel inquired. She beamed at the reference. "Yes, it's one of my favourite series." Shaylin chuckled. "Mine too. Funny when fiction works in reality. You're pretty good." So Zarin went into that spot, and all he saw was a shoe. That's when our friend popped out of the crate, like a jack-in-the-box, and clocked him across the head. The Sentinel saw that and just said, "You're pretty good." Barnov finished retelling the events, and the table erupted in disbelief, while Ariya grinned with mild embarrassment. To celebrate the end of the first day, they gathered at the refectory for dinner, and were joined together by a few familiar faces, including Kai, Oriana, and Emtak. A few new faces from Barnov's afternoon classes were also invited to sit with them. "So what you're saying is not to be fooled by the pleasantries," Emtak interjected. "Ariya actually knows how to fight really dirty." "I was just using the terrain to my advantage, as Sentinel Shaylin suggested," she replied impishly, before taking a sip of her mead. "And here I thought the mudslinging was the worst we'd see, but no. Ariya opened our eyes to how to truly kill chivalry." Barnov nudged the elf. "Sounds like she was just working smart, not hard." "Our instructor did have a point about using the terrain," Kai noted. "I'd be very upset if that's how I go down sparring," Emtak shook his head. "I get it could probably happen in the field, but shouldn't the fights be more about combat prowess and technique? Also, the whole thing about randomizing terrain didn't seem fair. Why not just have everyone fight on stone or grass?" "I think the Sentinel just wanted to do a quick assessment of our abilities and see how quickly we can adapt," Kai replied. "But you would know what kind of environment you're going into and dress appropriately. I wouldn't wear heavy armour if I had to fight in a bog, like in the first fight." Emtak shook his head as he took a sip. "I don't know why I'm getting riled up about it. I'm not even in the class." "What would you have done if the sneak attack didn't work?" Oriana asked Ariya. I think it would have boiled down to who had the better bladecraft at that point. Zarin was a bigger build, but he only had a dagger, while I had more of a reach with my sword. It might have gone either way, but I didn't want to take a chance on it.
So you hid in a crate? Emtak winked.
I used the terrain. Now I wonder how good you are at fighting out in the open, Barnov said, as she leaned back in her chair. I wouldn't say I'm a master, but I think I can hold my own if need be. I've learned from my dad and had lessons with instructors. Lessons with instructors? Sounds like such an upper-class thing to say, Emtak smirked. What does your dad do anyway? Given the covert nature of her father's work, she believed it was most appropriate to keep the details light. He works for the Edenvalian government, Ariya responded concisely. How clandestine, Emtak muttered, before turning to Kai. How about you? How did your first sparring session go? One-sided in my favour. Kai chuckled. My opponent seemed better versed in the arcane arts, and mentioned things would have gone differently if he was allowed to use spells. Does your instructor have something against casters? He sounds like the arcanophobes from Nixian. No, of course not, Kai shook his head. Sentinel Shaylin just wanted us to fight with the basics. I'm sure he'll gradually allow spells to be a factor later on. He should have had you all start with fists, if he really wanted to boil it down to basics. It's honestly relieving to see Arcana not held to high standards here compared to back in Edenvalia, Ariya noted. They treat you like second-class citizens unless you're a genius with spellcraft. No kidding, Emtak grumbled, folding his arms. I applied to multiple of their institutes and research apprenticeships, including to Lustir Arcanix, but they all rejected me. One of them made me do a practical exam, and I apparently failed to remember Lozic's third theory. Who still uses that in this day and age? It's mostly why I moved here. I've never been good at conjuring spells, so the only thing I can do reliably is this. Ariya held out her palm, closed her eyes, and whispered a draconic incantation, translating to, In the veil of night, I will be a star. Wispy, bright strands grew from the fingertips and spun above the centre of her hand to coalesce into an orb of white light. The patrons nearby looked curiously at their illuminated table, before Ariya clapped her hand and snuffed the orb out. That was pretty neat, one of Barnov's new acquaintances spoke in mild awe. Also pretty basic, Ariya shrugged. I'm sure Emtak or Oriana could create something far more impressive. I sure can. Watch this. Emtak pulled out a wand and flourished a pattern. He then pointed it to himself and quickly grew an extra foot taller. Yet what was more astonishing was when he moved his clawed hand to his face. It moved through his visage as easily as if it was air. I'm not actually taller. It's just an illusion to project me to be. Oi! One of the cooks called from the open kitchen. No spellcasting in the refectory. Sorry, Kai waved to them before turning back to the table. Arc flows and channels through us all differently. You may not be able to create complicated spellcraft, Ariya, but it can still help you with other talents. True. I feel like this was the right path for me, and I'm glad to be here. I don't think I would have had a fulfilling career if I stayed in Eden, and they probably would have suggested I continue to work at the museum. You worked at a museum? I love visiting them wherever I go, Oriana exclaimed. What kind of museum were you working for? I was at my uncle's art gallery in the Viso district. I don't know if you've been to it, but it was called the Kai Elar Museum of Art. Oriana gasped. I have been there. When I was a little girl. I don't remember much of it, but I do remember some of the sculptures, and nearly being crushed when I accidentally bumped into one of them. The tour guide caught it before it happened, and I got such a scolding from my mother. Aya went breathless as a memory flooded into her mind. A family of Infernus was visiting with a larger group of guests, and she was instructed to chaperone them. At the Rulini exhibit of glass sculptures, A small child lost her balance and caused a life-size replica of a crane to topple off the pedestal. Ariya's quick reflexes saved the sculpture from falling on top of her.
Was the sculpture you bumped into a glass crane? Ariya asked.
Oriana's brow furrowed. I remember it was a big bird. Why?
I think I was the tour guide.
There was a moment of still silence before Oriana's eyes widened and she let out a gleeful sound. It was you! What a small world! But how is that possible? It happened 17 years ago when I was 5, yet you look about the same age as us now. I was working for my uncle for almost 50 years before I had my second awakening and applied to be a Sentinel. Wait, I heard elves can stay younger for much longer than other sophonts, so does that mean you're around 60 years old? Excuse me if it's a rude question, but I'm genuinely interested in knowing more about your people, Barnov asked. I don't mind answering, Ariya responded before taking another sip of her drink. I'm 82. The majority of the table was stunned. 82? Barnov exclaimed. That is incredible. You're as old as my grandparents, and that is a very strange thought. Maybe elven people also have a secret exotic skincare routine too, Oriana quipped. Well, I do have a skincare routine, but elves are known to age at a much slower rate compared to other sophonts, Ariya noted. It takes about 2 decades for our bodies to fully develop into adulthood, and then it drops dramatically to about 10 times the rate as other species. So a 400-year elf would have the appearance of a 40-year-old human? Barnov asked. That's usually a good way of estimating it. If you're 82, doesn't that mean you already have decades of training? Why would you have to be back at an academy? Barnov questioned. Our people live for a long time, but the vast majority go through different career shifts after many decades. We call it awakenings, and I'm on my second. I decided to try venturing out and possibly being somewhere I can see history unfold in front of me. The major downside is, if it's drastic change, elves suffer from skill rot and can quickly lose competency in what they were once experts in. It's been over a decade since I've awakened, and I'm already having issues recalling historical facts that I used to be able to give easily on tours. So does that mean your parents, for example, have gone through multiple trades? Yes, I think my dad has gone through 8 awakenings, and my mum 10. Such a fascinating ability, Kai mused. That certainly reveals why I sometimes saw elves who were hundreds of years old, serving in roles that seemed menial. So how does one know if it's time to awaken? Does it come suddenly, or is there some ritual? It depends on the person, Ariya answered. For most, it's a slow process where they grow weary of the role and their mind wanders and seeks change, which is what happened to me. Others wake up one day and decide they want to shift to something new, or they're forced to by unforeseeable circumstances. My mum fell into the last category after losing her leg to an incident, and now she's a chef. There's also rare cases where someone stays on the same path for many centuries, and we call them everdreamers. I'm now curious to know if there are other species who also go through the same awakenings. It might be worth asking the next time I meet a dragon at the Langdran banks. The conversations between candidates continued and shifted into other light-hearted subjects as the sunlight faded and signalled the end of the first day. 2 nights later, in the lower tier of Ovyliax, a young girl gazed at the facade of a 3-story house which stared back with windows resembling empty pools of black. Devoid of lights and occupants, its terribly troubled history had left the property untouched and unsold for nearly a year. Children were warned to stay away, while even adults avoided crossing the front. Thus, the house on Barra Street was left alone, to be forgotten, and slowly rot with the passage of time. That was, until Airy and a few other students of Patoya School had disturbed its stillness in chasing urban legends. They were just stories, the young girl had originally thought. Fiction with no real power, besides creating chills and frights to those who heard them. Not once did Eri consider they would be the cause of her best friend's death. She also never imagined standing in the exact spot they found Aledizia's body, dashed against the pavement. She could feel her chest pound with fear, yet a letter she received said the truth would reveal itself if she came here alone. Everything about this felt wrong, but she had loved Aledizia and wanted to know why she died. Suddenly, the front door snapped open, beckoning her into its shadowy maw. With her hand gripped tight around her training wand, Eri stepped into the dark and the door closed behind her. "All right, we're going!" Luca cried out with sincere assurance while struggling to slip on his shoes. Down towards his knees, a medium-sized dog of muscular build vigorously wagged her tail to the point her hips swayed with the motion. She whimpered and tapped her feet in excitement until the shoes were finally on and the door pulled open. The leash wrapped around Luca's hand tugged hard, almost making him lose balance and topple forward. "Heel, Asta, heel!" he commanded firmly, with his footing recovered to hold her in place. Training took over impatient instincts, and the dog ceased trying to drag her owner. "Good girl. All right, let's get you to the restroom." Luca hurriedly led his dog across the street as she gleefully trotted along and heavily panted. They stopped at a small road verge of greenery, and Asta found a spot to relieve herself. As Luca waited, he looked down the street at the abandoned house and could not help but shiver at how ominous it appeared. The fact it was the only house with no illumination made it even more foreboding. "Doubt anyone is going to buy that place anytime soon with the recent news, huh, Asta?" he asked her rhetorically as she kicked up the grass to signal she had finished. Luca casted a spell on the feces to make them dissipate into the soil as fertilizer. "Ready to go in, or do you need a walk around the block before bedtime?" Asta's happy, smiling face was focused on her owner when an ear-splitting scream abruptly snatched her attention. An object landed hard in front of the house, and the dog immediately launched towards it with so much force that the leash slipped. "Asta! Heel! Heel!" he shouted with futility as she bounded with tremendous speed down the middle of the road. Luca sprinted after her, swearing at himself for losing his grip and at his dog for disobeying and putting herself in possible danger. Despite the dog having outpaced him by a considerable distance, he quickly caught up and saw her feverishly sniff the object before backing away and letting out a series of alert barks. "Founders, no?" Luca's pace halted with increasing trepidation as he realised what he saw. In a pool of blood and bits of shattered bone, a girl lay on the pavement with her limbs broken and twisted from the fall.